We have the next panel ready, and these are the two stalwarts. Now, look at the topic. I'm sure you all have agenda with you. The architecture of infra financing. Now, a topic which is not much talked about, much discussed. However, it is the key to building the long-term India growth story. And I'm going to create some context, some background, do not have any competency to talk on the subject. I will set the background and then have the stalwarts speak. Uh, so there has been a significant amount of reforms and efforts being made by India towards the infrastructure development. And at the same time, that is not enough. The way the requirement has grown up, the power, electricity, roads, and at the same time, as much as it's a challenge of building the infrastructure, it is equally a challenging task to finance the infrastructure requirement because it's a long gestation period. It has its own political angle to it, the pricing, the regulatory angle. I mean, in the good old days, we had banks financing it, but over a period of time, we also could see the banks being burdened with the infrastructure related financing issues. So what next? Because the requirement is going up and at the same time, there's a need for financing. And we have none other than the two authorities who have been extremely expert in driving the whole initiative about the infra financing. And that's where the title, The Architecture of Infra Financing, is going to be an extremely insightful session for all of us. I'm going to invite first and give a brief introduction, Padmanabhan sir. Padmanabhan sir, yesterday I already introduced him on the virtual platform. So sir, with your kind permission, I will again reintroduce you for the benefit of those who were not there. And please allow me to repeat myself. So before I go to the formal introduction of Padmanabhan, I'm sure all of you know, he is a conference mentor. For the last 7 years, and we are in the 8th year, he has been mentoring not just the entire context, the content, and even the lineup of the eminent speakers. He has been guiding us all throughout. Very, very close to the entire Almus conference team. It's a great honor and privilege to introduce him from this dais. Padmanabhan sir is an independent non-executive director Axis Bank. He is a senior consultant at the AZB Partners, a former chairman Bank of India, former executive director Bank of India. He himself, and this is my side of his introduction, he's been a great executive director Reserve Bank of India, and he's been a great academician, guide, mentor to all of us. We always look upon him when we are designing the entire conference. Over last many years, even after his retirement from Reserve Bank of India, he has been driving the payment systems in India, and that has been recognized by international banks. So we have indeed the honor, sir, to have you here in the middle of us. I know you are present virtually, and welcome, sir, to the day 2 of Almas Rupee Money Conference. And the next speaker, yes, he is there with us. And the next speaker, another personality, highly respected, former banker, turned professor. He has been the celebrity when he was in his banking career, and he is now even a bigger celebrity. I call him as a tall man who keeps reaching many heights every year after year. For us, we are really fortunate to have him actively engaged. He has been one of the key advisor for the entire Almas Rupee Money Conference construct. He has been with us, Dr. Anand Narayan. He is an international banking and financial market expert. He was previously with Standard Chartered Bank's regional head of financial markets for Asian and South Asia. And Dr. Anand, I remember 2017 when you were just transitioning from Standard Chartered to a new career. You were there with us. That was Almas' 4th annual conference. And I had actually introduced you like this, and I'm just quoting exactly from there, that every market participants knows you more than the designation after your name. So here we have Dr. Anand Narayan. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome G. Padmanabhan sir and Dr. Anand Narayan. Over to you, sir.
So Padmanabhan sir, I'm going to request you to start. But before you do that, one quick clarification. Maulik, thank you for the promotion. of giving me a doctorate. Just to clarify, I'm not a PhD. I'm just a simple Mr. Anant Narayan is fine. Padmanabhan sir, all yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning to all. I think let me also start with a clarification because I generally like to follow Anant. So let me start with a clarification. I think in the central bank, we have grown up saying that the market has understood what the central bankers or the formal central bankers say, then probably you have got it wrong. So I want to start off by clarifying one of the statements which Bijur made in the morning, that yesterday I said that India cannot have a vibrant market like Singapore. I did not say that. I think to put the context, if as a person who actually was associated right from Sudani committee in developing the Indian foreign exchange market, say that India cannot have a vibrant forex market, then I think I am over the hill. I should stop attending all the conferences. I think I was reacting to a statement which Maulik said that one country, one foreign exchange rate. Then I said that would be slightly a tricky proposition because the foreign exchange rate, in a way, the comparison, India has many countries within India. And if the exchange rate gets determined based on the purchasing power on one side, or with inflation, etc., this country has so much variety that to get to one rate everywhere, all over this thing would be a challenge. I didn't dismiss it. I said it would be a challenge. I was more concerned because ultimately, if we do reach that scenario where there is only one rate across the country, then I think Almas would lose its business also because Almas cannot be the rate setter in this country. So in a light event, so let me clarify that and get on to the topic that we are supposed to be discussing today, which is more about the infrastructure financing. Now, I don't claim to be an expert as far as the infrastructure financing is concerned. The background to this, let me put it straight, is that it came out of a paper that I prepared, particularly at the instance of our former governor, Dr. Urjit Patel, who encouraged me based on a panel discussion in which I participated, saying that it covered a whole gamut of issues that we should be trying to put this across as a paper, which we put together. I put together. I think a lot of help came. Many people saw it and gave comments. One of them being Anant Narayan. So we thought we will discuss some of the issues that we got discussed because we have traced the history of the issues relating to infrastructure financing as far as this country is concerned. Now, probably I must start off by saying that, again, going back to my days in the Reserve Bank of India, that while being in Reserve Bank of India, we always worried about two types of markets. One, which I would call as a messing market. The other I would call as a missing market. Now, the messing market was the one, which is obviously the NDF, which created a lot of problems as far as the currency management in this country was concerned, particularly when the rupee turned volatile. So there were debates as to whether Reserve Bank of India should intervene in this market. Reserve Bank of India should try to bring this onshore. And I think today we can talk about this with little more ease because I think Reserve Bank has moved based on Usha Thorat committee recommendations. In fact, they've gone a step beyond that and opened up the NDF market. And the GIFT City coming in, it became very easier so that today there is more or less integration between the two markets, and the initial indications that it has probably led to, I think, more stability in currency movements, just as some of the prediction Malingam made about opening up certain things as far as India is concerned. The other is the missing market. This missing market is going to come back into the discussion forum as we discuss this issue further, which is the corporate debt market. There's a corporate debt market, I think, is critically important as far as the infrastructure financing is concerned, but I think it never happened in this country. That is one market which was missing when I entered Reserve Bank. That is one market which is missing now that I've exited Reserve Bank. And this is where still people are still talking about this. Now coming to the infrastructure, first of all, I think I have to start off by saying that as far as the infrastructure is concerned, the country has moved a lot. Because we cannot decry whatever we have not achieved. We have achieved quite a lot. Look at the airports, look at the seaports, telecom, complete makeover, the roads, for instance. Now, one could also point to the huge railway infrastructure we have, and it's enormous. But still, I think the challenge as far as the railway infrastructure is concerned is the modernizing them, because I think these are all, most of them have been put in place by the British, and the modernization is a huge overhead again. I think again, the government has moved in several directions from the public sector EPC models. Once the PPP came in, I think the unhindered private sector, once they were introduced in the scene, we have made significant strides. Now, if you want me to give a few examples, since independence, the road length has increased from something like 4 lakh kilometers to nearly 60 lakh kilometers. Now, installed power capacity has increased from 1000 megawatts to almost 400 gigawatts. The number of electrified villages have gone up significantly from 3,000 to over 6 lakhs. The port capacity has gone up from 27 million tons to 1,400 million tons, and we have 137 airports, most of them getting modernized by the day in this country. No mean achievement. Now, let me also draw your attention to some of the very recent initiatives over the past 1 year that the government took. There has been a significant increase in the national infrastructure pipeline spend. 18 lakh crore has been set apart in the budget FY22. The national monetization plan has taken off. I think the Air India example has enthused many. The government has set up a national bank for financing infrastructure and development, authorized capital of 1 lakh of crore with 5 lakh in 3 years, and none less than an eminent person like KV Kamath has been appointed as the chairman. The special window for affordable and mid-income housing has been set up in 2020. They have also launched the India investment grid for the private investment coming into the stressed assets, which is a problem that we are trying to solve for as far as the financial sector is concerned. Many changes and norms have been made for the government contracts, and all these things have happened. Now, that's why I said no mean achievement. Enormous amount has happened, but I think we have still miles to go as far as this aspect is concerned. I think before we get into the critical issues or the real issues that we are going to discuss, now let me turn to Ananth and say, Ananth, your initial thoughts before we get into the crux of the financing issues. Ananth, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Padmanabhan. Much appreciate. First of all, again, I'd like to congratulate Maulik, Bijur, and the entire Almus family for doing this on a regular basis. I think the quality of discussions that you managed to put together are extremely high. Please continue doing this human service for the market. Mr. Padmanabhan, thank you for those opening comments. As you mentioned, and I would strongly recommend to everybody who's watching and hearing this, please do read that paper written by Mr. Padmanabhan around September of this year. Fantastic, all-encompassing paper that gives, while he says very modestly that he's no expert on infrastructure, I think he's being unduly modest. That paper covers a whole gamut of issues and also gives a few prescriptions around what we could do for infrastructure. So frankly, I'm wedded to that paper as well. So in many ways, we'll be singing from the same hymn sheet. Very quick thoughts, Mr. Padmanabhan, as you rightly mentioned, I think India has done a lot in terms of improving our infrastructure. You made points about highway, power, etc., electrification, etc. A few quick other statistics that I think are important. One thing we don't realize, 10, 12 years ago, we used to have a daily peak shortfall of power of between 10 to 12% of the total demand. Today, that shortfall is less than 1%, in many cases less than 0.5% in some states. We had a bit of a blip in October, but that was a very, very short-term blip, and things are back to normal now. As you rightly mentioned, our total capacity has gone up to close to 400 gigawatts, of which 100 gigawatts is renewable. solar and wind, etc. So a lot of good progress happening there. One area, sir, which I'd like to especially underline, which you should be taking some credit for, is the digitization and digital infrastructure in India. Tremendous achievements, which frankly, when I speak to foreigners and foreign investors, many of them don't realize it. And they once they realize the scale of what is happening, it's truly impressive. So quick statistics, tele density, or the number of people who actually have access to a telephone, was less than 1% of population in the beginning of the century. Today, it's 87% of the population. The number of people who have access to internet now is over 80 crores. And it's growing thanks to this entire telecom geo revolution, etc. That's growing in leaps and bounds. Financial inclusion, over close to 45 crore accounts open now for Jan Dhan Yojana, which means that actually the use of digital payments, etc., has gone up, and it's showing up. So if you look at all formal payments, which by the way includes check payments as well, as a percentage of GDP, that's now at about 220% of GDP, close to an all-time record. And by the way, this man here, Mr. Padmanabhan, as head of IT and DPSS, etc., in RBI, takes a lot of credit for the revolution that we saw in the payments system. The point is formalization and the digital infrastructure that we are building, I think is a fantastic piece of work as well, which should hopefully be leveraged as we go along into many, many things. Couple of points I will mention as issues that I guess Mr. Padmanabhan will pick up as we go along. One is in that paper that Mr. Padmanabhan wrote, he mentions a very stark statistic, which is that 18% of infrastructure financing in this country turned into NPAs. That is unacceptably high. No financing ecosystem can withstand that high a level of non-performing assets. And by the way, I think the true level of non-performing assets could be even higher, because we don't count the debt lying on NHAI, PFC, REC, which the ministers assure us are all fine, but we don't really know because we've not tested it as yet. We don't count that as part of the NPA process. So that's one big problem, I guess, that we need to sort out. The second problem, which I think is related to the outcome of infrastructure, if you look at the core issue of our country, it is the issues that we've had in increasing our employment. So CMI data says that the total workforce of this country is just 40 crores in a population of 140 crores. Okay, the worker participation rate in India is about 40% of the adult population, 43% as per the last ILO statistics, far lower than the 55 to 75% for all comparable countries, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Indonesia, Brazil, China, you name it, okay? Which means we are simply not creating enough jobs. Now, it shows up when we are seeing an increase in demand coming up now and consumption demand going up now, we are seeing imports going up, right? We are seeing imports of electronics, of gold, of chemicals, of plastics, of fertilizers, everything going up. Interestingly, our own IIP of domestic production is not going up that much. So a lot of our goods demand is actually met by cheaper imports, which makes no sense. We've got a good workforce, we've got a cheap workforce, per capita income is so low in this country, and yet we are not able to create jobs in Nevada. What does this have to do with infrastructure? There are a lot of issues which go behind us not being able to ride the manufacturing boom. We've missed the manufacturing bus in many ways. But amongst the many reasons, one reason which is often cited by people investing is infrastructure. The fact that the quality of our infrastructure can be a lot better. I know that's simplistic. There are lots of other things involved here. But to me, getting infrastructure right is critical for two aspects. One is, of course, improving the quality of our life, our access to health, education, public services, etc. Second, if we have to solve the issue of jobs in this country, which I think is the lowest common denominator, we solve for jobs, we solve every problem in this country, requires that infrastructure to be of a high quality, which will enthuse, this Atmanirbhar Bharat, PLI, manufacturing boom in the country. So from that perspective, we have to get this story right, at least now going forward. I'll stop there, Mr. Padmanabhan. Back to you, sir.
Thank you, Anand. Quite interesting comments, initial thoughts. I must say, first of all, thank you for bringing in that issue of digitization. I think what this country has achieved as far as the infrastructure, as far as the payments and the other aspects are concerned, I think I'll just take a minute. This I never intended to bring in, but since you brought in this issue, let me just read a quote from the CEO of CGAB, who talked about the Indian infrastructure, and that probably, I don't want to explain anything beyond that quotation because that says it all. What it says is that she says that India has been at the forefront of this fintech revolution with a unique public-private model that has propelled it to the vanguard of finance and technology. Not only has India been a world leader in building a digital ID, a world-class payment system, a large and successful microfinance industry, and a thriving e-commerce sector, and this is important, what comes now. It has done this with an eye to inclusion and ensuring a competitive landscape rather than winner-takes-all model that dominates the rest of the world. So the democratization of the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, I think is a huge achievement for which India is being lauded by the rest of the world. Anand, again, thank you for bringing that issue of the NPA, the 18%. That probably leads me to the next issue that I want to flag and then discuss with you. Is now the issue of maybe as we start actually the financing issues, if I start with the basics, I think it is often said that to give a quote to lead you there, that we had these when we really did not need them. And when we actually need them, we are looking to recreate them. I think all of you understand where I am getting at. I'm referring to the specialized financial institutions for infrastructure financing, better known as the development financial institutions or DFIs. We had a number of very good DFIs when the infrastructure development in this country was not the focus. It was not happening in a big scale. Many of these things did not thrive because probably the entrepreneurial skills were not there, and these were all shut down, and probably those days the banks were doing better. They were all shut down. They became universal banks. The banks started mimicking DFIs. And I think this story has been the way, whatever way you look at it, it has been either comically tragic or tragically comic, because basically the asset liability structure of a typical bank balance sheet does not help too much as far as the infrastructure financing is concerned, or which is basically long term. I think the country did try segmented experiments like the PFC, the REC, the HUDCO, IRFC for specific verticals. We also created an institution called IIFCL in 2006. But although it has achieved quite a bit, I think it has, if we want to be very candid about it, failed to achieve the goals that we set up. And now we are thinking, or we have just created a new DFI, because we think that without a DFI, the infrastructure development in this country cannot go the way that we expect that to happen. Anand, the issue is that how does this new institution overcome all these challenges? I'm seeking your issues, particularly because the government, as we all know, has a very ambitious investment target of 111 lakh crore over the next 5 years. That's a huge number. And now, according to me, when we set this up, there are two new things which probably one was never there, the other had much lesser importance. I'm referring to the COVID, and I'm referring to the ESG issue, on which I think we are going to have a separate debate later in the afternoon, because these two are becoming critical when we are looking at raising finance in the international market. Because one of the things that COVID has resulted in, I think very little of the private sector is prepared to use their balance sheet for putting in money or long-term finance. And ESG is a separate issue that is developing, which actually adds in a way to the cost of financing. Now, again, Anand, I would love to hear your thoughts in this regard.
Sir, slightly unfair. I was going to ask you this question, but you asked me this first. So, but anyway, I will give my 2 bits, and then I will ask you to please react and add to that, because frankly, you know this area far better than I do. But to the point that you made, sir, in your paper as well, about 18% NPAs, and to my mind, possibly even more hidden NPAs that have not yet come out. It's difficult to pinpoint this down to any 1 or 2 reasons. There are multiple things that we have to learn from the whole process. It's fashionable to blame individuals, including auditors, bankers, promoters, rating agencies, and governments, and environment ministry, and so on and so forth. In my mind, it's all of the above. Frankly, no party comes out looking good in all of this. There is a lot of learning to be done by every single stakeholder in the process, including people, investors, like many of the people sitting in this room. But I would broadly put down the issues that we have to learn from the past experiments on infrastructure financing, which didn't work out well, down to 3 issues. The first issue, sir, is relating to government policy and execution. Things like environmental clearances, things like land acquisition, things like policy stability, not changing the laws one day just because you had something for breakfast in a particular state, ensuring that there is continuity. So the policy part, frankly, is outside of the control of bankers or the companies. You cannot bargain for a change in government, suddenly canceling all past contracts. Those kind of issues is one particular bucket. The second big bucket, sir, as I see it, is unfortunately our very, very litigative court process. Contract enforcement in this country, as we all know, can be very, very tough. By the way, there is a statistic which was quoted by the Chief Justice of India, which said there are 4.5 crore cases pending in the country. As of today, 45 million cases. According to his estimate, it would take 360 years to clear that backlog, even if there were no fresh cases which came up. Okay, so you can imagine the frustration of a person who's facing litigation on a land acquisition. I was speaking to an investor yesterday who was talking about setting up a steel plant, this is an overseas investor, and the trouble they went through in trying to acquire land in a smooth fashion in this country. So that's a second big problem. The third relates to governance. In terms of ensuring that we don't have under-invoicing, over-invoicing, ensuring that the books are truly free and fair and a good representation of what the risks are, etc. So to me, these are the 3 big issues. I don't think it's an issue of lack of savings. To the point you made earlier about availability and the needs matching together. Look at it this way, sir. Our total M1 money supply, which is currency in circulation, current account, savings account, is about 48 lakh crores. Okay. At this point in time, the average fixed deposit rate in banks is 5.07%, the lowest we've ever seen in history. Okay. At a time when inflation we think is about 11%, in household expectations are about 10.8% or so for inflation. So the point is, savers are desperate to try and get good returns on long-term savings, right? At the same time, they simply don't have any avenues to channel that into good productive investments into what we need as infrastructure, etc. Right? Instead, we are being pushed into equity markets to take on more risk than we ought to be taking, or into things like Bitcoin and gold, etc., which are simply not productive. So to me, it's not an issue of lack of savings. It's a problem of channeling those savings into the right investments. Where I think this DFI can help, sir, is particularly when it comes to the first angle of trying to sort out for government, and actually the first and second of government and court issues. I don't think it's an issue of raising funds in the market. If the DFI can stand up and say, you know what, execution risks in terms of policy, in terms of environmental clearances, in terms of land acquisition, etc., I will take care of that performance problems. And the government therefore underwrites that these projects will be executed at least as per commitments. That takes away a big uncertainty that people have around project execution. If it can be extended to include legal issues as well, which is very, very tough to do, but if it can be included that as well, I think the DFI would have played a human service of at least removing a big level of uncertainty in the minds of investors. I know the DFI is being more thought of as a savings channeling kind of investment as it was with IFCL, etc. But I think it would do a much better service if it just took care of the execution and the project completion risk, rather than actually trying to channel funds. But I would love to hear your thoughts, sir. You're the expert on this one.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you have covered most of the things, but let me add a couple of things to it. I think the related question that I asked myself when I try to answer this question is that, why is it that let's say unicorn, take the example of Zomato, is able to raise any kind of money in the market, But the infrastructure financing in this country, we have been talking for 5 decades, and the financing is really not smooth. I think there are 2-3 issues that we have to consider. Now, first, if you have to go and talk about the issue of the banks getting into problems with this, I think to be fair to the banks, I'm not holding the brief for any bank, having been chairman of a large bank for 5 years, that they got everything right. But I think most of the issues with regard to the infrastructure financing getting stuck is not on account of poor appraisal. Yes, that had a slice, but I think the major issues were all external because of the environmental clearance getting delayed, because of the project. This country never had a great example of completing projects in time. Now things are changing, but anybody can stall a project at any point of time, and this becomes an issue. So the other issue is that when you are asking a bank, the specialized financial institutions like DFI, what do they bring on the table? I think they bring specialized knowledge. I mean, just to clinch this issue, let me take a personal example and try to articulate this. When I was starting my career in Reserve Bank, the first few years, and I was initially starting to go for inspection of the banks, I was at that point of time in Trivandrum office, and I was deputed to inspect the largest cashew financing branch of at that time it was Indian Bank in Quailon, which is a district next to Trivandrum, to go. So one of my mentors called me and asked me the question, "What do you know about the cashew industry?" I said, "Nothing." Then he says, if you know nothing about the cashew industry, what are you going to inspect? So first of all, sit down, spend a couple of days, understand the cashew industry, then go and look at the financing aspects as you would understand nothing. I bring the same issue back to the public sector banks. Now, public sector banks, every one of them in different size, shades, etc., getting into every type of infrastructure financing on a consortium basis, based on an appraisal done by somebody, and the viability study or the industry is never understood and appreciated fully by the people who are actually financing and monitoring. Now, there is a problem. And this problem becomes bigger when these external issues come in. This is one part of the issue that we need to be conscious about. The second issue is the sanctity of the contracts. Now, you look at, I need not specify a state. We have the state governments completely overturning even the World Bank contracts. Then the originally decided capital city was thrown out. Then they talked about 3 capital cities. Now that has got thrown out. So what is happening, nobody knows. Enormous amount of money, etc., had been spent. So when you are talking about some kind of, assurance as far as the return is concerned, this return, it becomes really critical, because this is critical in the infrastructure, because too many entities are involved in respect of getting this going smooth, and the disruption can come from anywhere. And that's an issue which becomes very critical. The second is, I think, people often quote as a classic example of infrastructure financing, which went beautifully, is the tunnel financing between England and France, where certain people took the implementation risk, certain people came in, they stayed for 3-5 years. It was a 99-year project, financing aspect, and I think things are moving very smoothly. But initially, I think even the Reserve Bank of India guidelines with regard to the takeout financing, all these issues had a lot of problems for these things to work very smoothly as far as infrastructure financing is concerned. So I would argue that the infrastructure financing requires special understanding, special type of skills, which were not really understood by the people who mattered, and that things got into very difficult situation. Many of these things have been sort of resolved. I hope these things will work more smoothly, but these are the lessons I would probably caution that the DFIs will have to keep in mind before they actually go ahead and finance, because the expertise in the various areas which they are financing and people being there on a long-term basis, it becomes very critical because the risks are different. The risks are long-term. And unless you are able to give an assurance to the investor, this is where the problem would come in as far as the investment is concerned. One more aspect regarding this, I think in return on investment, there is a market rate of return, there is an economic rate of return. I don't know whether Anand would like to add to that once I finish, is that the market rate of return purely for the entire length of the project, the cost becomes exorbitant. So somewhere some balance will have to be found. This is where the government has a role in terms of credit enhancement, etc. So I am saying that nowhere in the world, banks have entirely financed the infrastructure. It has been long-term funds like pension funds and all these kind of things, but never without the government support. So the government has a major role to play to make sure that these happen seamlessly. Do you have any addition to make, or Anand, can we go to the next issue?
I think we can go to the next topic, sir, but very quickly, I just want to reiterate what you said. While I talked a lot about taking care of the performance risk, particularly of governments and courts, I totally agree with your point on the need for good project appraisal skills. Reality, sir, is that the last round of big infrastructure financing that we saw, a lot of it was herd mentality financing. There would be one large merchant banker or a project finance institution which would say this is a good project. And then the whole bunch of people would come and say, yeah, this has been certified by so-and-so, so I'm also happy to do this. And then everybody would take comfort from the fact that everybody else was there. And, you would do all this collective lending without necessarily doing the financing. I think that lesson needs to be learned as well. Especially project financing is a very, very specialized area, particularly for infrastructure. So you need to have very, very special skills. One quick point I want to make, sir, is relating to the point you made about digitization. Because a lot of data is now available in a digital fashion, and the availability of credit, for instance, is very, very clear through GST and cash flows and account statements, etc. The ability to do project appraisals and to do credit appraisals has improved dramatically. So which means that even the credit appraisal skills within the banks, and for that matter, mutual funds, insurance companies, pension funds, etc., need to go up and take advantage of this digitalization. I know of one particular analyst sitting in Singapore, sir, who actually discovered frauds in a very large housing finance company well before the you actually had an auditor go through it formally and come out with it about a year later. And the only source he used for finding out those gaplas was actually Google. Going through MCA databases, asking the right questions, got him to explain to him how things are being siphoned out of the company. Point being that a lot is actually available right now through the digital means, which actually should be enhancing our credit appraisal. But I think the points you made are absolutely spot on, sir.
Okay, I think given in the interest of the time, there are two more issues which I want to discuss to make this discussion sort of complete. One issue, I think most of it, I would probably give my thoughts, is that the question that is often getting asked is that, is there any role for the central bank or the monetary policy as far as infrastructure financing is concerned? Prima facie, to a purist, this question will look completely ridiculous because everybody knows that monetary policy is intended to affect the short end of the curve, whereas we are talking about long-term financing as far as the infrastructure financing is concerned. But having said that, I think this is where the point that you made becomes important, and that becomes a responsibility of the central bank also. I think it is the job of the central bank to anchor the inflation expectations and to ensure a reasonably stable exchange rate to make sure that the so-called long-term investment of these investors get protected. And unless the central bank is able to do this, I think they'll always be worried as to what they are getting into because it'll become a bottomless pit. I mean, that I think needs very little explanation. But the issue is there are two ways in which I think the infrastructure financing, at least as far as this country is concerned, is being looked at as debated as far as the experts are concerned. One is the asset monetization. Through the asset monetization, generate funds for infrastructure financing. And the second issue they talk about is that you go and take the money from the richest balance sheet in this country, which is the central bank's balance sheet. I think on both these aspects, Anand, probably this, you cannot claim that I know better, you know better. So your comments, please, before we get on to the last topic, which is the corporate debt market.
So very quickly, sir, again, I push back on that. I think you know better than I do, having been a central banker yourself. My views on this are slightly controversial, sir, and I know I'll get chappals from you later on, but I'll say it anyway. First part, sir, is the notion that you can use a central bank's balance sheet and FX reserves and that kind of nonsense for funding infrastructure, I think is complete nonsense. I normally do not use such strong words. I always leave room for doubt, but I have no doubt that trying to use countries' reserves for domestic purposes makes absolutely no sense at all. And I'm happy to chat about it more if required. But one area where I do think there is a role for central banks to play, which is where purists will disagree with me, is I think interest of inflation and long-term inflation being brought down also is tied to adequate investments going into infrastructure. Unless you have money going into roads, ports, manufacturing, etc., you will not solve the supply side, and therefore you will not bring down inflation. To that extent, I do not see I see a role for the RBI and for the central bank to actually facilitate the flow of funds to specific sectors. Now, this is something that purists don't like. You know, even export refinance, for instance, there were a lot of purists who didn't like it. But I think RBI could potentially think about opening a window for long-term refinance of maybe loans into ESG compliant projects, especially as we look to net zero by 2070 and 50% of our power capacity in renewables by 2030, etc. So directed windows, just as we had TLTROs for NBFCs, sir, through COVID. Some kind of TLTROs for infrastructure financing and for ESG financing, I think makes sense. But I know a lot of central bankers would vehemently disagree with me and not want to go into sector-specific financing. I'll stop there, sir.
No, agreed. I think particularly your point that raiding the balance sheet of the central bank makes no sense for domestic financing. It makes eminent sense because if it's a forex reserve we are talking about, these forex reserves will again get back to the central bank to stabilize the rupee. So it makes no sense. How much of this becomes a foreign exchange component? That's an issue I think that is well settled. Anyway, thank you very much. I think let's move on to the corporate debt, which is more important. I think as far as the development of corporate debt market is concerned, I think Sama, Dhana, Beda, Danda, everything has been tried. And now SEBI is attempting to come out with some new issues. I think Mr. Mahalingam did make his comments in one of the conferences about trying to put a repo corporation. Ultimately, I think unless we are able to develop a corporate debt market, and by developing a corporate debt market, we are talking about a vibrant secondary market, because somebody who is putting money for this infrastructure cannot be asked to, with an inverted commas, hold to maturity. It doesn't work. He has to have an exit route when he has to get out, and the secondary market liquidity becomes very critical. And this is where I think many of the issues are getting stuck. Now, if I, again, in the interest of time, this is a topic by itself. If I just push you, can you think of a couple of things that we need to think about, maybe not conventional, out of the box, to say that we need to think about this for infrastructure or for corporate debt market to develop. Interestingly, Mahalingam's keynote address did refer in a way to unconventional methods the central bank will have to think about to infuse liquidity by dealing with more participants. Just a lead. I leave this with you and your thoughts quickly on 2 or 3 things which we need to think about.
So with your permission, I'm going to turn this question around to you because we have a panel. I see the panelists already, Mr. Mahalingam and Neeraj, and we will be discussing some of these issues where I'm sure I'll get an opportunity to express my views. And I do have strong views on this topic. But specifically, sir, what I would like to hear from you is an RBI perspective. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but Khan Committee in August 2016, I think, suggested that RBI should start to accept at least some high-grade corporate bonds as part of the LAF reverse repo, etc. It's been 5 years since then and counting. Still no sign of any signs of intervention by the RBI or impetus from the RBI that they will intervene in corporate bond markets at all, which is one reason why probably SEBI has to step in this first place. I would love to hear your views as an RBI person, sir.
No, I think interestingly, when we were discussing this topic, Dr. Rangarajan, former governor of Reserve Bank, sort of agreed with me when I said that ultimately what we need is a trusted third party, whatever it is, whether you call a repo corporation or anybody else, who has to be standing in to provide this liquidity. Unless we are able to have a secondary market development, I can't understand why Reserve Bank will have to be puristic about saying that some of these high quality bonds cannot be accepted in the interest of market development. We know that during global financial crisis, the Fed went to the extent of taking any cover without even looking at what is in that cover. It could be a ton of shit, and they were financing, about that. So I think, again, we need to think out of the box to do this, because unless we are able to trigger this and bring this market, I think again and again we'll be going back to the same issues and discussing this. I think we have hopelessly run out of time. Just a couple of things I want to state before I close. I think one of the issues which came a very interesting issue is the suggestion put forward by the Nobel laureate Merton, when he talked about selfies. And selfie expands to standard of living indexed, forward starting income only securities. He says the government or the municipalities is best equipped to issue these securities, both to take care of your pension benefits, your social security, and also infrastructure financing. And this does not have complicated calculation. This is simply linked to the standard of living index. And he says that if the standard of living index improves, these entities have an automatic hedge so that they will be able to finance these bonds, service these bonds without much of difficulty. And finally, I think in one of the earlier discussions, we did think that probably time has also come about for this country to think about a specific infrastructure law to make sure that anybody and everybody does not simply throw out contracts entered into by the previous administration or the previous government. This becomes critical to ensure that the investors do have their confidence in coming into this particular area. These are my final thoughts. If you want to say anything more, Anand, fine. Otherwise, we will sort of thank each other and thank the organizers.
Thank you, sir. I think you summarized excellently. You forwarded the paper as well on selfies. I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think you covered all the points extremely well. The governmental risk, government has to be involved. There are ways in which we can match savers and much needed investments in infrastructure. I think selfies could be a route for that. So thank you. I think very well put, sir. Learned a lot.
So thank you. Back to the organizers.
Thank you so much, Padmanabhan sir and Professor Anand Narayan. It was indeed a thought-provoking session, last 35 minutes. You touched upon a number of points. You covered, the whole gamut of infra financing, the huge requirement, the financing requirement. Anand, you also talked about the skill sets that you require to actually have a project financing in place, including the role of central bank that is primarily focused on the short-term financing. At the same time, it is a role play when it comes to long-term creating an infrastructure. So thank you so much, sir, for a very, very engaging and a thought-provoking session.